You weren't supposed to hear this. Not from me. Not from anyone. But once you do, you'll never walk through your family's home without questioning the walls themselves. Because sometimes, bloodlines hide more than heritage. Sometimes they hide desire. Imagine this: a quiet farmhouse in the early 1900s, far from the eyes of any church or law. Inside, a brother and sister sit at the dinner table, their knees touching under the cloth, their glances too long to be innocent. The air hums with something unspeakable. Something passed down not in words, but in touch, in secrecy. And the family, they don't stop it. In fact, they protect it. This isn't a love story. This is a legacy, a system older than the country itself that understands one truth: if you want to keep the bloodline pure, you break every law of nature to do it. This is how dynasties keep control: by turning inward. By folding the family tree in on itself until the branches rot. The newspapers never printed their names. The church records were burned. All that remains are whispers, passed through journals hidden in attic chests, and testimonies taken under oath only when the witnesses were close to death. And every account says the same thing: the moment you see it, you can't unsee it. Because this isn't about lust, it's about control. It's about taking the body, the vessel of identity, and making it serve the family's will, no matter the cost. In their eyes, outsiders bring contamination. Outsiders bring rebellion. Outsiders bring the possibility that a son might think for himself, or a daughter might escape the land she was born to inherit. And so, they close the circle. They make lovers out of siblings. They make pawns out of children. And they keep the dynasty intact. You think this is rare? You think this was some isolated, twisted family in the backwoods? Then I have to tell you the truth. This isn't one story. This is a pattern. And once I show you the connections, you'll understand why the most powerful bloodlines on Earth have spent centuries protecting a secret you were never meant to hear. You've been told incest is a crime of impulse, a sickness of the mind, a moral failure. But what if I told you that's only the story they feed the public? Behind closed doors, in candlelit rooms where the family crest hangs above the mantel, incest was never about weakness. It was about power. Ancient Egypt knew this well. Pharaohs married their sisters not because they lacked options, but because they refused to dilute their divine blood. The same was true for the royal houses of Europe, where marriages between cousins, and sometimes closer, weren't scandals. They were strategies. Each union was a legal fortress, keeping land, wealth, and influence locked within the family circle. You see, when a family's empire grows too vast, its greatest threat is not an enemy army. It's the outsider who marries in. One wrong union, one ambitious stranger, and the bloodline becomes vulnerable. That's why some of history's most influential houses created their own unbreakable chain, sibling to sibling, cousin to cousin, generation after generation. But here's the thing: when you turn love into policy, something darker begins to grow. The intimacy isn't about romance. It's about ownership. The bed becomes the boardroom. The womb becomes a vault. Every child is an investment, and every night is a transaction in the name of the dynasty. You might be thinking, that was the past. That's ancient history. But look closer. Modern records are cleaner, yes, but the patterns remain. Old money doesn't just vanish. Power doesn't scatter by accident. Families who controlled continents a century ago still hold influence today, and they still keep their bloodlines carefully curated. And when the world catches on, they don't deny it. They redefine it. They hide it behind academic terms like endogamy, behind private schooling, behind exclusive social circles where the right people just happen to keep marrying the right people. But in certain corners of America, far from the marble halls of Europe, this same philosophy sank its roots into isolated farms and remote estates. Without the royal titles, without the gold crowns, it became something cruder and more dangerous. Because in the absence of ceremonial grandeur, it was stripped bare to its raw form: the belief that family owns family. And in one of these places, the line between ancient tradition and living nightmare vanished entirely. That's where our story turns next. It began in the hills of Appalachia, where roads turned to dirt and names carried weight heavier than gold. The family was known only to those who needed to know. An old clan whose lands stretched farther than the eye could see, passed down since before the Civil War. They didn't farm for profit. They didn't work in the mines. Their wealth came from something older: a web of land deeds, hidden mineral rights, and a century of calculated marriages that never reached beyond their own kin. The patriarch, a man they called uncle, even if he was your father, ruled with a voice that could freeze the air. His word was law. His approval was currency. And his children, well, they weren't really his children. They were his property. You didn't marry for love here. You married for blood. Your husband might also be your cousin. Your wife might also be your sister. And no one dared speak against it. In this world, the rules of the outside didn't apply. They didn't need them. Here, the Bible was read selectively, the lawman was kept at arm's length, and the preacher, well, he had family too. Outsiders weren't welcome, not because they were strangers, but because strangers carried the virus of freedom, the dangerous idea that you could choose your own life. The houses were close, sometimes joined by hidden doors. At night, the lights in one home would go dark, and in another, a single candle would burn until dawn. If you were a child in this family, you learned early that blood wasn't just thicker than water. It was everything. It was the reason you existed, the reason you would marry, the reason you would have children of your own. And when the inevitable happened, when babies were born with eyes too far apart or lungs too weak to take more than a few breaths, it wasn't spoken of. They buried them on the family plot unmarked. The soil there was heavy, almost black, as if it knew what it held. For over 100 years, no one questioned it. Not the sheriff. Not the neighbors. Not even the victims. Because here's the cruel truth. When you are born into a system like this, it doesn't feel like abuse. It feels like duty. It feels like love. But one night in 1954, a fire ripped through one of the homes, and in the ashes, investigators found something they could never unsee. Something that forced the family's secret to the surface. For a moment, before it was buried again. The fire started just after midnight, when most of the valley slept. By the time the first neighbors arrived, the old clapboard house was a furnace, its roof glowing orange against the black sky. The smell was thick, not just of burning wood, but of something heavier. The acrid bite of hair, flesh, and wool all charring together. When the flames finally choked themselves out, the place was unrecognizable. The front steps had collapsed. The dining table was nothing but a warped skeleton of metal legs. And in what used to be the upstairs bedroom, they found the bodies. There were 3 of them. 2 were children, both with hair so light it looked white under the suit. The third was a young woman, her hands still clutched around the smaller child, as if she'd tried to shield them from the heat. But it wasn't the way they died that made the investigators look away. It was their faces. Even in death, there was something unmistakable. A mirror, like sameness, as though the children weren't just siblings, but copies. Their eyes set at the same angle, their noses with the same unusual curve. To an outsider, it looked like coincidence. But to a trained eye, to the county coroner who'd seen hundreds of bodies, it looked like the kind of repetition that doesn't happen unless the gene pool is a closed loop. Word of the fire spread fast. People whispered in the post office, at the feed store, behind church doors. Some claimed they'd always known something was off about that family. The way they never seemed to welcome strangers, the way the children never played with anyone outside their own blood. Others swore the fire wasn't an accident at all, but a reckoning. And yet, just as quickly as the whispers started, they stopped. The sheriff closed the case as an electrical fault. The coroner's notes vanished from the county files. The bodies were buried in the family plot, and the surviving relatives rebuilt the house in the exact same spot, as if erasing the fire from memory. But here's what no one outside that valley understood. That fire didn't destroy the family's power. It cemented it. In their minds, surviving outsiders' scrutiny was proof they were untouchable. And when you believe you can't be touched, you don't just keep your secrets, you grow bolder with them. What came next wasn't just hidden. It was flaunted, in ways so subtle that only those inside the circle could see the performance. After the fire, the family didn't retreat. They consolidated. To outsiders, the rebuilding looked like resilience. To those inside the bloodline, it was a declaration: nothing will stop us. The new house was bigger, with thicker walls, narrower windows, and a central room that no guest was ever allowed to enter. Life resumed, but with an edge. The surviving patriarch, Uncle Ray, though he was father to more than half the children in that valley, began hosting Sunday gatherings. Not at church, but at the house. Everyone who came was kin, whether they admitted it or not. These weren't casual meals. They were rituals. The same hymns were sung in the same order. The same dishes served. The same toasts made in Uncle Ray's deep, slow voice, each one ending with the same phrase: blood is truth. That phrase became more than a toast. It was law. It was carved into the underside of the dining table, burned into the inside of the barn doors. Children grew up hearing it before they could read. And if you questioned it, you were met with silence. The kind of silence that tells you the rules are older than your life and will outlive you. But the most unsettling part was the pairing ritual. It happened quietly, away from prying eyes. Around the time a boy or girl turned 16, they'd be taken aside by one of the elders. There'd be a talk, not about love, not about choice, but about duty. You'd be told who you'd marry, and it would almost always be someone who shared your blood more closely than anyone dared to admit out loud. The elders dressed it up as fate. They'd talk about how the family's blood was blessed and chosen, how outsiders would dilute it, weaken it. They'd pull out an old, leather-bound family Bible, its pages thick with handwritten names, and point to the patterns, tracing them like they were scripture. By the late 60s, it wasn't just the family who played along. The entire community, the shopkeepers, the sheriff, even the preacher, had learned not to ask questions. Some out of fear, some because they owed the family money or land, and some because they were in the family, even if they didn't share the name. What looked like rural isolation from the outside was, in truth, a fortress of allegiance. And a fortress this tight doesn't just protect secrets, it manufactures them. And soon, the family would produce one secret so dangerous, it would send ripples far beyond the hills. It happened in 1972, in the kind of summer heat that makes the air shimmer. The family had gathered for one of their Sunday rituals. The long table set, the candles lit even in daylight, Uncle Ray presiding like a king without a crown. The children sat in two lines, boys on one side, girls on the other, each with the posture of someone who had been taught their place before they knew the meaning of the word. But that day, one child didn't follow the silent script. Her name was Leela, 16, sharp eyes, a little too curious for her own safety. She'd grown up hearing, blood is truth, like a prayer, but in the quiet of her room, she'd begun to wonder if maybe truth was something else. She'd been writing things down, scraps of overheard conversations, strange entries from the family Bible, and most dangerous of all, the names, the real pairings, the proof of who was lying next to whom under the cover of night. Nobody noticed her slipping away from the table that afternoon. Nobody noticed her slipping a manila envelope into her bag, and nobody knew she'd been planning this for months. Leela had a friend from school, an outsider. His father worked for the county paper, and though he didn't understand the weight of what she was giving him, he promised to keep it safe. Inside that envelope were photographs of the family Bible, sketches of the land map with the hidden burial plot marked in red, and a handwritten list of names that connected generations like a spider's web. But here's the thing about webs, they catch the wrong prey sometimes. The boy showed it to his father. His father showed it to the editor. The editor, after one look, locked it in his desk and made 2 phone calls. The first was to the sheriff. The second, no one ever knew. By nightfall, the envelope was gone. The editor said nothing. The sheriff said less. And the boy, well, he vanished. His family claimed they'd moved away to the city, but there was no forwarding address, no goodbyes. Leela didn't speak for weeks. Then one morning, she was gone too. Some said she ran. Some said she was taken. The family never mentioned her again. But for those who'd seen even a glimpse of what she'd gathered, the message was clear. This was not a secret you tried to take outside. And yet the truth has a way of seeping through cracks. Even in a fortress, the walls can sweat. It started small, just a ripple in a stagnant pond. A census worker new to the county noticed something odd. The surnames were the same across entire roads. Birth certificates listed fathers who were suspiciously old or suspiciously absent. Marriage licenses were rare, and when they did appear, the bride and groom's mothers often shared the same maiden name. At first, it was dismissed as rural quirk. Isolated communities have a way of folding in on themselves, after all. But the worker had a habit of asking questions. The kind you don't ask here, and those questions found their way to the state office. That's when the second ripple hit. A state social services agent, young, ambitious, convinced she could fix things, came down to the valley. She spent 3 days knocking on doors, filling out forms, making polite conversation over weak coffee. On the 4th day, she walked into the courthouse with a folder so thick the clerk's eyes went wide. Inside were photographs of children, with features too similar to be explained away, notes on unregistered unions, and whispers about unmarked graves. Her report was meant to trigger an investigation. Instead, it triggered silence. Within a week, the folder was gone from state archives. The agent was reassigned to a desk job 3 counties over. And a man no one recognized, tall, gray suit, government plates, was seen driving slowly down the family's main road before disappearing into the hills. From then on, the family behaved differently. Not quieter, bolder. As if someone higher up had given them an invisible shield. The Sunday rituals grew larger. The pairings became more deliberate. And the phrase blood is truth was spoken not just as tradition, but as defiance. That's when I began to understand something most men never will. Power doesn't always hide in skyscrapers or capitals. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, in houses with peeling paint, in people who look like they have nothing, but who hold the one resource you can't buy or fake, a closed, controlled bloodline. And if someone up top decides that bloodline is useful, they'll protect it no matter the cost. It was no longer just a family secret. It was part of something larger, something with reach, something that would soon make it clear. This wasn't just about incest. It was about engineered loyalty, the kind you can't break without breaking the person entirely. Engineered loyalty is not love. It's not devotion. It's ownership disguised as belonging. The family had perfected it long before the state came sniffing around. And once they realized someone in power might be watching over them, they sharpened it into a weapon. It started young. Children were taught that outsiders were dangerous. Not just untrustworthy, but poisonous. They were told stories of cousins who married beyond the bloodline and died mysteriously. Or were never heard from again. These weren't bedtime tales. They were warnings, etched deep into the mind before a child could even form their own opinions. Disobedience was dealt with quietly. A boy who refused his pairing was sent to work, north, never to return. A girl who tried to run was brought back in the dead of night, her hair shorn as a public mark of shame. No one dared speak of them after. It wasn't punishment for the sake of cruelty. It was a demonstration. A reminder that your life was not your own. The rituals reinforced this truth. At every gathering, Uncle Ray, or whichever patriarch held the chair at the head of the table, would recite the lineage aloud, naming parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, each pairing a reminder that you came from inside and you would stay inside. The list was like a spell. By the time your name was spoken, you were already hypnotized by the rhythm, the history, the weight of generations pressing down on you. But here's where it turns darker. This wasn't just about keeping the family pure. This was about creating people who could never betray the inner circle, because their entire sense of identity was wrapped around it. If you control someone's past, their present, and their future, you control them. And that kind of control is valuable to more than just a rural dynasty. Certain men, strangers in suits, never giving names, began visiting the valley in the 80s. They didn't come for land. They didn't come for money. They came for people. Young men and women from the family would vanish for weeks, sometimes months, only to return quieter, more obedient, their eyes carrying the stillness of someone who had been broken and rebuilt. That's when the whispers began. That the family wasn't just protecting itself, it was supplying something. Something human. Something trained. And if you think I'm exaggerating, listen carefully to what comes next. Because this is where you'll start to see the larger machine. The one you were never meant to know exists. The first time the pattern revealed itself, it came in the form of a photograph. A faded Polaroid, found in a shoebox during an estate sale 3 towns over. In the picture, a young man from the family, dressed in a crisp military uniform, but not the kind issued by any branch you'd recognize. No insignia, no name tag, just a perfectly tailored jacket, a flat expression, and eyes that didn't quite look like his own anymore. The man who found it swore he'd seen the same uniform in an old black and white newspaper photo, except that one was taken on the steps of a government building in D.C. decades earlier. The faces were different. The blood wasn't. You see, the family wasn't just inbreeding for purity. They were building a product. Generations of isolation had created something rare. People who were predictable. People whose behaviors, instincts, and loyalties could be forecast with precision because their minds were shaped by the same stories, the same rules, the same fears. To an outsider, that might sound useless. To the right kind of buyer, it's priceless. A bloodline like that can be turned into soldiers who don't question orders. Couriers who will die before speaking a word. Operatives who vanish into rural towns, blending in as harmless locals until they're activated. By the mid-80s, whispers said the family had a benefactor. Some called it a government program. Others believed it was older. A private network of men who didn't care which flag they operated under, so long as the work got done. Either way, the arrangement was simple. The family stayed untouched by law enforcement, and in return they sent their most reliable members away when called upon. The pairings became more selective. They weren't just matching for blood anymore. They were matching for temperament, strength, obedience. It was breeding, plain and simple, but for a purpose no outsider could prove, and anyone who got close to proving it. They ended up like Leela. This is where most men turn away. They tell themselves it's too far-fetched, too paranoid, too much like a conspiracy novel. But you're not here for comfort. You're here because something in you recognizes the truth when it stares you in the face. And the truth is this: families like this one are not anomalies. They are assets. Assets hidden in plain sight, in towns you drive through without a second glance, waiting for a signal you'll never hear. It happened on a rainy October night in 1987, in a city 200 miles from the family's land. The news called it a random act of violence. The papers showed grainy crime scene photos, a smashed sedan, a dead city councilman slumped behind the wheel, and a suspect shot dead at the scene before he could be questioned. But buried in the police file, in a section marked internal eyes only, was a driver's license that didn't match the body. The face was the same. The name wasn't, and the address led straight back to a rural mailbox on the family's main road. Witnesses described the suspect as quiet, polite, and strangely calm, even in the seconds before the gunfire. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He walked up to the car, put 2 bullets through the windshield, and then stood there, waiting, like he knew his life ended with that job. The councilman he killed wasn't just any politician. He was a man about to expose a corruption ring that tied developers, state officials, and certain federal contractors together. 2 days before the murder, he'd requested an unscheduled meeting with a journalist. The same journalist who vanished a week later, his apartment stripped of notes and tapes. The official story was airtight: a drifter with no family, no history, and a violent streak. But the coroner, the same one who'd been in the valley after the 1954 fire, told a different story to those who knew how to listen. He said the man's dental records didn't match the alias on file. He said the bone structure reminded him of someone he'd seen decades earlier, a boy in the hills with the same sharp jaw and the same unsettling, steady stare. The family didn't mourn publicly. They didn't even acknowledge the man was one of their own. But that Sunday at their gathering, the toast was different. No hymns. No feast. Just Uncle Ray raising his glass and saying, "Blood keeps its oath." In that moment, the message was clear: the family wasn't just surviving, they were serving. And whoever they were serving was powerful enough to erase trails, rewrite narratives, and turn a killing into a footnote. The tragedy is this: once a bloodline learns it can kill for power and be rewarded, it doesn't stop. It perfects the craft. They didn't call it training. They called it raising you, right? But every moment of your childhood in that family was a conditioning drill, whether you understood it or not. It began with the circle. Every child, by the age of 5, was made to stand inside a chalk ring drawn in the barn. Around them, the elders would pace slowly, repeating phrases in unison: blood is truth. Truth is loyalty. Loyalty is life. You couldn't step out until you repeated it without hesitation. At first, it felt like a game. By the 3rd or 4th time, it felt like breathing. You didn't know you were being programmed. You thought you were being loved. Obedience was rewarded with presence. If you pleased the elders, you were allowed to sit closer to Uncle Ray at the Sunday table. You might be given a sip from his glass, a signal to everyone else that you were coming up right. Disobedience wasn't met with beatings. That would have been too obvious. Instead, you were erased. No one spoke your name. No one looked at you. Meals were taken without you. That isolation was worse than pain, because here, identity came from belonging, and belonging came from blood. Fear was layered in subtly. If you asked about someone who had gone north, you'd be told a quiet story of betrayal and what happens to those who turn on the family. Sometimes, those stories came with a prop, a piece of clothing, a broken toy, something that had belonged to the person before they disappeared. It was never explained how the item came back. It didn't have to be. And then there was the binding. Around puberty, every child was brought into the locked central room, the one guests were never allowed to see. There, they'd be told the full lineage, generation by generation, until they reached their own name. The point wasn't history. It was ownership. By the time you heard your name, you understood. You were not separate. You were not free. You were a link in a chain that stretched back before your birth and forward past your death. This was how the family created their instruments, people who would act without question, because the question itself had been erased from their minds. And once that conditioning was complete, the outside world wasn't a threat, it was a stage. It was 1994 when the family placed their first true instrument, in plain sight. He was 24, tall, with a clean, unassuming face. The kind of man strangers trusted without realizing why. His name, for the world's benefit, was Daniel Clay. But to the family, he was simply kin. Daniel had been groomed for this since birth. He was one of the quiet ones. The kind who didn't ask questions. The kind whose eyes never flickered when given an order. His placement wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated through a series of introductions: a sympathetic county official here, a chance meeting with a state senator there, each step carefully arranged by hands no one could see. Within 2 years, Daniel was working in the office of a congressman whose district just happened to include the family's land. From the outside, he looked like a young man on the rise. Sharp suits, good manners, and endless willingness to work late. But inside the machine, his purpose was singular: to be the eyes and ears of the bloodline. Daniel's first test came during an election cycle, when rumors surfaced about the congressman's ties to illegal land acquisitions. One of those acquisitions was dangerously close to exposing a hidden burial site on family property. If the press connected the dots, decades of secrecy would go up in flames. So Daniel did what he'd been trained to do. He didn't argue. He didn't panic. He quietly redirected the investigation, feeding reporters carefully chosen leads that implicated a rival politician instead. Within weeks, the story shifted. The rival was disgraced, the burial site was forgotten, and the congressman publicly praised Daniel for his discretion and loyalty. What no one outside the family understood was that this was more than politics. This was a blood oath fulfilled. The burial site Daniel protected wasn't just a piece of land. It was the resting place of children who died in the name of the dynasty's purity. Protecting it wasn't about the past. It was about making sure no outsider ever gained the leverage to touch them. From that point forward, Daniel's position was untouchable. And every Sunday, when he returned home to the valley for the ritual toast, Uncle Ray would raise his glass and lock eyes with him. A silent confirmation that the chain held firm. It was proof that their reach didn't stop at the hills. It stretched into offices, policies, and laws that shaped the lives of people who would never even know the family existed. By the late 90s, the family's influence had already slipped into city councils, state legislatures, and judicial benches. But politics was only one leg of the throne. Influence without money was like a gun without bullets. They needed capital that couldn't be traced, wealth that moved in silence, and power that could choke a man's livelihood without ever laying a hand on him. That's when the other branch stepped forward. The one the rest of the family whispered about as the ledger keepers. These weren't farmers or hunters or small-town patriarchs. They were the ones who never got dirt under their fingernails, the ones who spent their lives inside air-conditioned rooms lit by green bankers' lamps and humming fluorescent tubes. It began with a single investment, a charitable loan, to a struggling regional bank. On paper, it was philanthropy. In reality, it was a chokehold. The bank's survival became tied to the family's goodwill. Soon, the bank's board was filled with cousins, in-laws, and loyal family retainers. Loan approvals became a subtle form of currency. Friends of the family got generous terms, enemies found themselves drowning in denials and audits. From there, it spread. They bought shares in local construction companies, trucking firms, and agricultural suppliers. Each purchase was made through shell corporations so dense and complex that even the IRS would have needed a decade to unravel them. By the time anyone noticed the pattern, it was too late. The family didn't just own land anymore. They owned the roads that crossed it, the banks that financed it, and the supply chains that fed it. And the brilliance of it was in the appearance of legitimacy. Everything looked above board. No one saw the subtle handshakes at fundraisers, the unspoken agreements made over bourbon in private country clubs. The family didn't need to threaten anyone outright. They simply controlled the oxygen. If you wanted your business to breathe, you played along. If you didn't, you suffocated quietly. Inside the valley, this new financial arm was celebrated like the arrival of a new harvest. The elders called it planting seeds in the city. And at the Sunday toast, the patriarch's voice would linger over those words. But for the younger generation, the lesson was different. Power wasn't just about keeping outsiders away from the valley. It was about making the outside world depend on the valley. Without ever realizing it, by the turn of the millennium, the family's grip on legitimate enterprise was absolute. But legitimacy was a slow, moving beast, weighed down by regulations, audits, and the ever-annoying paper trail. The real acceleration came when their financial roots began snaking into a darker soil, one tilled by men who never signed their real names and never spoke on record. It didn't happen through some cinematic meeting in a smoke-filled warehouse. It was quieter, almost polite. A family-controlled trucking company took on a lucrative new contract, transporting special shipments for a client whose background was opaque. The invoices were vague, the deliveries happened late at night, and the warehouses always had more cameras pointing outward than inward. No one asked questions, because asking meant admitting you knew. These clients, at first, just shadows in the ledger, began paying in ways that were oddly fluid. Sometimes in cash so crisp it felt freshly printed, sometimes in gold coins that had been out of circulation for decades, sometimes in debts forgiven by men whose reputations made accountants sweat, and soon the family's trucks weren't just moving produce or construction materials. They were moving unmarked crates, sealed drums, and parcels that had to be signed for by hand, never by name. This overlap with organized crime wasn't messy, it was surgical. The family never handled drugs, never touched weapons, never trafficked in flesh. They simply moved things. Things that happened to vanish from manifests. Things that always arrived exactly where they were meant to, untouched and unquestioned. And in return, the family received not just money, but insurance. Protection in cities where their financial interests were most vulnerable. Enforcement in rural pockets where locals got too curious or too defiant. Even favors from people whose influence reached the kind of political offices where scandals quietly die before they're born. Behind closed doors, the elders spoke of this new arrangement as the shadow orchard. Just as a tree's roots spread unseen beneath the soil, so too did their alliances spread in the underworld. Hidden, interlocking, impossible to trace. And like those roots, they were nearly impossible to cut without killing the whole tree. The beauty, and the danger, was that it blurred the line between their clean money and their dirty protection. By design, you could never fully prove which dollar came from which side of the orchard. And for anyone foolish enough to try, the message was always the same: some fruit is sweet because you can't taste the poison. It began with a sound that, for the family, was more terrifying than gunfire: the knock. Not the polite, neighborly kind, but the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who already knows you're inside. It was 2007, a damp spring morning, when federal agents arrived at the family's flagship warehouse under the guise of a routine inspection. At first, no one panicked. They'd faced audits before. They'd passed everyone. But this time, the agents didn't wander aimlessly, pretending to check safety codes. They moved with precision, heading straight for Storage Bay 6, a section the family kept locked with a double-key system. What happened next was a nightmare in slow motion. The steel doors were pried open, and inside were 3 unmarked crates, stacked neatly, sealed with military-grade locks. The kind of locks that didn't just say, valuable. They screamed, classified. Nobody in the building had the keys. Not even the warehouse foreman, who swore on his mother's grave he'd never seen them before. The agents didn't open the crates immediately. They photographed them, documented every angle, called in a separate team. The air inside the warehouse shifted, that oppressive, static heaviness that comes when everyone knows something is about to change, but no one can stop it. Rumors ran wild. Some whispered about stolen military tech, others about biohazard materials. A few claimed they contained nothing more than paper, though the way they said it made the word sound dangerous. And then, just as suddenly as they'd come, the agents left. They didn't seize the crates, didn't cut the locks, didn't even tape the doors shut. They simply filed their reports, took their photographs, and walked out, leaving the family to stew in uncertainty. For the next 48 hours, paranoia devoured the inner circle. Every phone call felt tapped, every shadow in the street looked like surveillance. A meeting was called, one of those rare gatherings where every branch of the bloodline was represented. Tensions flared. Was it a warning? A test? Or had someone inside tipped them off? Finally, word came from an unofficial source that the inspection had been ordered not by the feds directly, but by a certain congressional aide, one who had recently been made aware of the family's special contracts. Whether it was meant as blackmail or a show of leverage, the message was clear. The crates were not to be opened, but the family was no longer invisible. The meeting stretched into the early hours, lit only by a single bare bulb swinging over the table. Not because the family was dramatic, but because the electricity in the safe house had been deliberately cut. No one wanted electronic eyes watching what was about to be discussed. They needed to make the crates disappear. but not in a way that would look like panic. If they moved too quickly, it would scream guilt. If they waited too long, they risked the agents returning with a warrant and opening them in broad daylight. The first suggestion was blunt: burn them. Destroy everything, contents and all. But the patriarch shook his head. Fire leaves smoke. Smoke leaves questions. Questions leave trails. It was the kind of cryptic wisdom that, in this family, wasn't up for debate. Instead, they turned to one of their most elusive assets, a man known only as Cinder. He wasn't a blood relative, but his loyalty had been purchased years ago through a combination of debt forgiveness and whispered threats. Cinder specialized in making things move without being seen. He didn't just transport, he ghosted. Trucks he drove were never recorded on toll cameras, ships he boarded never showed on manifests, and the cargo he carried vanished into the kind of places GPS satellites weren't designed to see. Within hours, Cinder had a plan. The crates would be shifted during a scheduled rail shipment of industrial waste bound for an incinerator in Nevada. Only the crates wouldn't make it to Nevada. Halfway through the journey, at a forgotten refueling station in the desert, they'd be swapped for identical decoys filled with scrap metal and useless junk. The originals would be diverted to an underground storage site carved into the cliffs of an abandoned mining town, a location so remote it didn't even appear on modern maps. Execution had to be flawless. Cinder warned that if the agents were still watching, any anomaly in the train schedule could set off alarms. For 3 days, scouts were posted along the planned route, watching for unfamiliar vehicles, unmarked drones, or curious hikers who just happened to have high-powered lenses. The night of the move, rain poured across the desert, a gift from whatever god still tolerated their existence. Visibility was nearly zero. The switch happened in under 6 minutes. The train never slowed enough to draw suspicion, and by sunrise, the crates were locked deep in a place where no one would find them without a death wish. But the family's relief was short-lived. By the next evening, a plain envelope arrived at the patriarch's estate. Inside was a single photograph, one of the crates, taken after they'd been hidden in the exact underground vault they now called safe. It wasn't just the feds watching. The photograph was more than a threat. It was a signature. The patriarch didn't need to flip it over to know who had sent it. Only one rival would dare to infiltrate their hiding place without taking the crates outright: the Marrow Syndicate. The Marrows weren't in the business of stealing. They were in the business of reminding. Every move they made was meant to carve a message into the mind of their enemies. We can touch you whenever we want, and you can't touch us back. For years, the family and the Marrows had avoided open conflict. Not out of mercy, but because war between them would be too loud, too bloody, and too public. Both sides dealt in shadows, and shadows don't survive under floodlights. But the crates, they weren't ordinary contraband. The whispers claimed they contained something older than both families, something that could shift the balance of power in every corner of the underground. The patriarch studied the photo again. The angle wasn't from a hidden camera. It was taken deliberately by someone standing in the vault, steady and close. Whoever had done it wanted them to know they'd been there long enough to take their time. A second item in the envelope made it worse: a strip of faded red cloth, frayed at the edges. The room went silent when it slid out onto the table. Everyone recognized it. It was the same cloth that had been wrapped around the wrist of Matteo, the family's most trusted enforcer, the man who had personally guarded the vault during the move. He had vanished 2 nights ago, supposedly on personal business. Now there were questions no one wanted to voice. Had Matteo been taken, turned, or worse, had he been working for the Marrows all along? The patriarch didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. We don't talk about this outside this room. Not to wives, not to children, not even to the walls. But silence was already a luxury they couldn't afford. Every hour that passed was another hour the Marrows could decide to act, and no one in the family knew what their next move would be. By midnight, they all knew one thing: the crates weren't theirs anymore. They were bait in a game the Marrows had been planning for a very long time. The crates were never meant to be opened by mortal hands. That was the first lesson the patriarch's father had taught him about them, and the first rule he had broken by keeping them in the family vault. In the farthest reaches of the old docks, under a warehouse whose roof sagged like a dying animal, the Marrows were already peeling back the lids. They didn't work with crowbars or brute force. The locks weren't metal, they were rituals, bound with salt, blood, and bone. One by one, those bindings snapped like twigs under the touch of the Syndicate's archivist, a man so pale his skin looked like wet paper. When the first crate opened, the air shifted. The dock lights flickered. Somewhere deep below the floorboards, the water groaned as though something vast and ancient had turned in its sleep. Inside wasn't gold, wasn't weapons, wasn't anything the world would recognize as treasure. It was a glass cylinder, tall enough to come up to a man's chest, filled with a black liquid so thick it seemed to absorb the light around it. Floating within was a skull, elongated, cracked in places, with teeth too many and too sharp to belong to anything human. Its empty sockets stared as if it were aware of its release. The archivist smiled. "One of 4?" he whispered. "And the others will come willingly now." The Marrows didn't just want the relics for power. They wanted them for awakening. The crates were pieces of something whole, something buried before written history, something the family had been tasked, centuries ago, to keep from ever walking this earth again. Back in the family's war room, the patriarch stood before the vault's empty shelves, the photo still clutched in his hand. He didn't need a seer to know what came next. If the Marrows succeeded in opening all 4, no bullet, no blade, no fire would be enough to contain what would rise. The war between the two families was no longer about territory. It was no longer about dominance or pride. It was about whether the world as it stood would survive the season. And in the shadows of the docks, the black liquid inside the cylinder rippled, as if something on the other side of it had just opened its eyes.